Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of Study 1. In our last video, we had a look at the presidency of Yuan Shikai from 1912 to 1916, that early Republican era. Now we're moving on to a period known as the Warlord decade, which is from 1917 to 1927, when warlords had sort of fought each other for control of different provinces. And in this video, we're looking at two popular movements that took place during this period. The first is called the New Culture Movement, and the second is the May 4th movement. So let's have a look at an overview of the New Culture Movement. So partly due to the failure of the 1911 revolution, China's young people embarked on a re-evaluation of China's place in the world. It was sort of an intellectual activity of trying to understand where China fits and how they can move forward into the modern world. This became known as the New Culture Movement. The New Culture Movement, which was headed by young intellectuals and adopted by students, sought to create a new cultural identity for China by, first of all, questioning Confucian traditions, which had been around for thousands of years, finding new writing styles, and examining China's future. New ideas and ways of thinking were explored, including nationalism, feminism, liberalism, democracy, anarchism, socialism, Darwinism, Marxism, Leninism. So many new ideas were considered and discussed in these very sort of intellectual realms. Historian Rana Mitter described this period as intellectually and socially one of the most promising and exciting times in Chinese history. So the impact and significance of the New Culture Movement. First of all, there were multiple areas being discussed during the New Culture Movement and multiple leaders of this movement. For instance, Cai Yuanpei at the Beijing University discussed innovations with students and things like that. Hu Shi wanted to create some innovations in language and the vernacular. Lu Xun was very critical of Confucius and Confucian values, and he was another leader of this New Culture Movement. Chen Duxiu led the New Youth Movement, which was really mobilizing students in particular. Li Dazhao focused on nationalism and Marxism, and Ding Ling was a feminist writer at this time. Now, the New Culture Movement led to anti-imperialist and later anti-warlord protests erupting in all the major cities in China, particularly Beijing and Nanjing. Chinese nationalism increased over the course of the New Culture Movement, as this was one of the ideas that was being explored, particularly following Sun Yixuan's 3 principles of the people. Students and the urban youth became increasingly radicalized and revolutionary. There were also major intellectual, cultural, and literary innovations. So it was a time of great change and great hope for many young people in China. In terms of its significance, many Chinese revolutionary figures, including Mao Zedong, were influenced by or involved in the New Culture Movement. So it was sort of the starting point for many future revolutionaries in China. The May 4th movement. So in early May 1919, students in Beijing were preparing for Day of Shame protests. Remember that they take place on the 7th of May, commemorating the signing of the modified version of Japan's 21 Demands by Yuan Shikai just a few years earlier. While they were preparing for Day of Shame protests, they received news about the peace agreement that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, students and people in China were very aware of what was happening during World War One, and they were aware of the peace deal that was being made in Versailles. And they had hoped that German concessions in Shandong province would be returned to China. Little did they know that the national government in Beijing, which at this point, after Yuan Shikai's death, didn't have that much power. Really, the power was in the hands of different warlords throughout China, but it still existed. And so the national government in Beijing had made a secret agreement in 1918 to give those German concessions to Japan. Now, as you can imagine, these students finding out that these concessions that were meant to be returned to China were actually going to Japan, and just as it happens, this all happening as they're preparing for their Day of Shame protests to commemorate Japan's 21 demands. These students were outraged. The Day of Shame protests were brought forward to the 4th of May, hence May 4th movement, and Beijing students took to the streets with over 3,000 students rallying in Tiananmen Square. Now, when we watched The Last Emperor, when Johnston arrives in at the Forbidden City, it is those protests taking place that he is standing in as he's arriving in Beijing. So 3,000 students rallied at Tiananmen Square, and once many of these students were arrested, protests in support of the students and supporting their cause broke out in cities across China. Workers went on strike and Japanese goods were boycotted. Now, the May 4th movement created a real sense of urgency in the resistance of foreign imperialism and warlord corruption. And many members of the movement turned away from this idea of a democratic Western style sort of democracy, similar to Britain or the US, and looked towards Marxism and towards what was happening in Russia at this time with the Soviets. And that leads us to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. So as I just mentioned, young intellectuals became disillusioned with the liberal politics of the West and looked instead to Soviet Russia for inspiration. The Russian communists at this point were keen to encourage revolution abroad. If you'll remember from when we were studying the Russian Revolution, in the early years of the Sovnarkom, they were really pushing for encouraging a global socialist revolution. And it was only after the Polish War, at the tail end of the Civil War, that they moved away from encouraging international revolution and towards just locking down their own version of socialism in Russia. But that was 2 years after what we're looking at here. So at this point, Russian communists were really keen to encourage a global socialist revolution, and they founded the Comintern, or the Communist Internationale, in March 1919. In April 1919, a Comintern agent came to China and met with Li Dazhao, who was a significant figure in the New Culture movement, who he was interested in nationalism and Marxism. And he had already formed a Marxist study society at Beijing University. So this was sort of the first meeting between Russian communists and Chinese Marxists. On the 3rd of June 1921, a more senior Comintern agent, who is known by the pseudonym Ma Ring, arrived in China, and he was a great organizer. And so on the 23rd of July 1921, he organized the first National Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, only 12 delegates were present, and it had to be held in secret. However, Mao Zedong was one of those 12 delegates. He attended as the delegate from Hunan province. And this Congress, while it was very small and contained and held in secret, this did mark the official birth of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP was initially very small with, like I said, there were 12 members at the Congress, and they only represented a total of 57 members. Even, only a few years later, even by 1925, they still didn't have 1,000 members even. But they did eventually grow. And so the new culture movements, later the May 4th movement, really contributed to growing revolutionary attitudes in Russia and contributed to particularly young people moving towards socialism and communism and Marxism as ways to approach the future for China. And so the founding of the CCP, while it was a small affair, is rather significant. I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I'll see you next time.